We're glad to have you back. Now, food insecurity is still a major global concern as 1 billion people are suffering from starvation, hunger, and malnutrition. However, in Africa, food insecurity has been attributed to be driven mainly by armed conflict, drought, and economic turmoil, as well as the Ukraine conflict, which is making a dire situation even worse. According to the United Nations, an estimated 346 million people in Africa are affected by food crisis, leading to suffering of acute hunger on the backdrop of continued conflict and insecurity, especially in countries such as Nigeria, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and South Sudan. With Nigeria as the epicenter, the African Development Bank declared that hunger has become a way of life in the country and other African countries, thereby calling on the federal and state government to take strong measures to alleviate hunger and avert untold hardship that will be occasioned by food crisis. To give us more perspective into this, I'm being joined virtually via Zoom from the United Kingdom by a researcher and agribusiness economist, Dr. Matthew Ojo. Dr. Ojo, good afternoon. It's good to have you on the program.
Good afternoon, Tolu. It's nice to be back here.
Yes, the United Nations report, or an arm of the United Nations coming up with this report, to me, remains very worrisome. So first, let's start with what you think about this. You're in the field and also in the classroom and everywhere. So you know what is happening with regards to all of this data. Is this new to you that 4.3 million Nigerians lack adequate food, and in all 170 million people across the continent?
Thank you very much, Tolu. I don't think it's new to many who have been following the food crisis trend over time. And when you see this kind of reports, it just reminds you on the things that we need to put in place as Africans to be able to surmount the challenge of food insecurity. Okay. Now, generally, even before this report, there was a report that came from the World Bank Global Report Food Crisis that talked about up to 205 million, okay, likely to face acute food insecurity and needing assistance in about 45 countries. And so when you juxtapose that report with the one that is just released by the United Nations, you understand that it's not a new development. It's just that Africans, as we are, need to start looking at what we need to do differently from all we've been doing before now. So if you have that kind of a report coming from United Nations, and it's also talking about Africa, then you need to now look inward and ask, why is this happening as it concerns, Africa, where we have large population of Africans involved in agriculture. Nigeria, for example, statistics tells us up to 70% of the citizens are involved in agriculture. So what is the challenge and what is the issue? If you also remember that the United Nations Agenda 2030, where you have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, poverty, okay, is the number one goal, followed closely by hunger. It says, no poverty, that's goal number one, and zero hunger, goal number two. And if you look at these two, these are the two major issues that are troubling Africa. You have poverty and you have food issues, food insecurity. Of course, you also know that there's a popular saying in Yoruba that once you remove food issues out of poverty, that the poverty is half solved or is almost solved. So the real issue here is not just the concern about poverty in Africa, but the problem of food security, which has constantly been a major challenge for the continent.
Here, Mali, about 13.9 million persons. That's about 73% of their population. But Nigeria, we have 64.7, which is about 32% of the population. Some analysts say it could even get worse as we move to the dry season. What do you think around that?
Yes, it can get. we should ask ourselves constantly is, if we are talking first about Africa having challenge, how committed is the African continent and heads of government in Africa in tackling insecurity? I've come on this earth before and I've mentioned that over 20 years ago, we had the Maputo Declaration. And then in 2014, we had the Malabo Declaration. And if you go back to 20 years back, you will look at it. It is required, or many African governments made commitments to be able to put aside 10% of their budget, okay, annual budget, to fund agriculture. As I'm talking to you now, Nigeria has averaged only about 2% in the past 7 years. That is when you look at the proportion of funding that goes to agriculture out of the entire federal government budget. In Ghana, the one for last year was around 1.95%. And if you look at Kenya itself, Kenya averages are between 2 and 3%. So we keep on asking ourselves, it's not just enough to say United Nations has released a report, World Bank has released a report. We internally as Africans know the challenge or the challenges agriculture is facing. But my concern and what should call for worry is the commitment that over the years, okay, has not been shown in ensuring that that sector receives the kind of attention it requires or it needs. So I don't know, it's almost like we are wishing for something miraculously to happen. If you don't fund agriculture, if you don't fund research, if you take things for granted, data, for example, Africa agriculture will not develop without technology. So we will constantly have these issues surrounding food security as a continent. And of course, Nigeria's case is always saddening each time I remember or I try to look at it. It's sad to see a country that has up to 38 million hectares of arable land and suffering this much from food insecurity. So we need to look and ask ourselves, what do we need to do?
Before we get to that point of what we need to do, the planet's population is about 8 billion, and it's predicted to get to 10 billion by 2050. And they say food insecurity will still be high, considering soil degradation, climate issues, and all of that. I know you're already researching all of this, but what effect does this really have? And like you said, what is the way out? What effects will it have on the people when they cannot feed? Then what is the way out for governments? Short term, medium term, and of course, long term.
Yeah, when you talk about, let's look at these causes. What are the issues that are aggravating the food challenges generally in Africa? And of course, Nigeria is part of Africa. You want to look at the productivity issue, all right? When you see inputs, when you see outputs increasing in terms of a particular crop in Africa, most of the times is because you have more people going into that production using more spaces or using more land. So it's not about using the same land and then getting the most out of that land, which we term productivity or yield as it concerns agriculture. That's a major issue. Productivity is a challenge. Then you have the issue of insecurity, as you have in Nigeria, you have in Mali, you have in some other African countries, you have in Congo Democratic Republic. These insecurity issues are also exacerbating the food insecurity challenges that we're having in Africa. So where you don't have peace, people can go and produce, and because they can't go and produce, there will be challenges in terms of what they can get out of the land. Then you have the climate issue, all right? The climate issue is there, the climate is changing, and food production is the most affected, if you like, when it comes to changing climate, because you have rains not coming as you ought to, drought everywhere. Then you also have the physical impact of the climate change itself, flooding and the likes. And as we go towards rainy season, there have been prediction of flooding. So it also affects production. All these, okay, put them together with the issue of improving technology or adding or using technology in terms of our production, which we have not been able to do. So when you have a population, for example, in Nigeria, where 70% are involved in agriculture and we still can't feed ourselves, you have other countries, for example, like US, I've mentioned this before, where just about 5% of the population is feeding the entire nation. So these are the things that are contributing, and they can be controlled. Some of them, you just mitigate against them and see how you can adapt, especially as it concerns climate change. So when we don't do all these things, as a continent, it becomes challenging. So at times you wonder whether we're waiting for the developed nation to come and still help us, give us money to do some other things, without us committing ourselves as we ought to. Raising national budgets to agricultural sector up to 10% is something that is doable over a span of a number of years. So talking about solution, short term, mid term, and long term. The short term, all right, is to first, I've always said, you cannot solve a problem when you don't have a full understanding of how it's affecting you. Let's have a review, short term. What is going on? How do we solve this? How do we ensure that in the next 10, 5, 15 years, we get ourselves out, or we reduce the challenge now to about half of what it is? So that is, the planning has to be based on data, review. Then the medium term is, you start funding gradually. When you start funding the critical areas where you expect to get the most out of, then you see that will leverage the low-hanging fruits. What are the things we are producing ourselves as a nation or as a continent? How can we leverage on that? How can we increase productivity in those crops that we are producing? Not all crops come from outside the continent or comes from outside Nigeria. There are things we produce and we are leading, but how do we maximize them? How do we take advantage of those crops to also affect other areas where we need to develop our production? So those are the kind of things we need to start looking. What usually annoys me is the way politicians look at food issues in the country. A governor comes and say, they want to improve agriculture, and they go and buy 20 hectares, 20 tractors, they call TV stations to come and film it and be showing to the whole world that they're investing in agriculture. The issue is not what you are bringing in. After you've brought all that, what has changed between when you bought those tractors and before you bought them? Has food production increased in the country? Has it increased in your country? Has it increased in your state? So those are the kind of things we need to turn our eyes away from this camouflage, how will I put it? This noise making and pretending to be funding agriculture, whereas we just want a show. So if we go beyond that and start looking at the critical areas of how to increase productivity, leverage on technology, we might be able to reduce these food insecurity challenges over the years. When you talk about long term is you have to now plan. Okay, can we model the entire agricultural structure of Nigeria? Put them into modeling and then see what you can project, what you can remove, what you can add. You see, when we keep on saying this, it's always as if we're saying the same thing over and over again. And I wonder when we want to look at food issues critically. My take is this. I might be wrong, but I feel that we've sort of weaponized food poverty. Food poverty is when you are unable, okay, to access, the kind of diet you want and the kind of nutrition you want. And when I talk about access, it has to do with, having the required monetary enablement. So weaponization of food poverty or of hunger has become a handy tool, unfortunately, in the hands of many leaders in Africa. Nigeria is a typical example. The last election is a typical example. So we need to do beyond what we are doing. If not, we'll keep on getting all these reports every now and then.
One there. Well, we're already setting an agenda, and I think that is what we should do next. Let's set an agenda for the incoming administration with regards to the agricultural space. A lot has been said around the economy, around the power sector. But, we must be able to feed ourselves. Just like you said, once food is away from the whole settings, the poverty is addressed one way or the other. But I'm going to ask you, what do you think needs to be done? Let's have some specifics now that that could actually take us away from where we are and put us where we should be if things are done correctly.
Yeah, thank you, Tolu. Let me start this way. You see, the realization of what the incoming government is going to face or is going to address is important in all these agenda setting. The incoming government needs to understand that in terms of Global Food Security Index, the report released in 2022, Nigeria ranks 107 out of 113 countries. So whoever is coming in as a Minister of Agriculture, or even the new government, needs to understand that we are only better than 3 countries in Africa, and they are Madagascar, Burundi, and Sierra Leone. The incoming government needs to understand that in terms of poverty, 133 million Nigerians are poor. And this poverty is in terms of multidimensional poverty. But when you talk about monetary poverty, 40% or 40.1% of Nigerians are poor. The incoming government needs to understand and fully appreciate the fact, okay, that Nigeria has what it takes. According to FAO, it tells us that agricultural land in Nigeria is around 70.8 million hectares. So when you have that full understanding, the question is, how do they go now and start addressing them bit by bit to reduce the pressure upon Nigeria? If you have that understanding that the household income that is spent on food in Nigeria is over 60%, then the agricultural sector will not be used as a compensation, political compensation for those who helped you to get into power. Having said that, I think the next and important thing for the incoming government, I've said it before, to do is to sit down and say, how did we get to where we are first? And then do a holistic review. If they just want to hit the ground running and start doing things the way it has been done, we will continually get the kind of results that we are always getting. So we need to start thinking how to do things differently. We need to start thinking how to hold people accountable to ensure that if you say you are in charge of agricultural sector, then what can you do? What are you doing to reduce food challenges of within your domain, whether it's the state or it's the federal? So Tolu, we can keep on setting agenda for these people. I think the onus is on you, the media, to keep on pointing your searchlights on the activities of the government as it concerns food, whether at the state level or at the federal level. So it's not just setting an agenda. How do we monitor them? How do we evaluate them? So when we keep on doing all these things, they will be on their toes, and then Nigerians can be able to, they might not have much, but if they have 500 naira with them, and they only need to spend 50 naira to feed, that's about 10%, then you'll be happy. The challenge is that so much is spent on food, and people don't even know where the next meal will come from, and our leaders are not paying much attention to that. It's a very unfortunate situation which must change, because when the hungry become hungry, you can't control the devastation that can come from it.
Interesting conversation as usual there. Well, what do you expect? You're talking to an agribusiness economist and a researcher, Dr. Matthew Ojo, joined us from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much. Well, do have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
All right.